Some of the questions that we will raise tonight. Joining me now is my colleague Rajiv Dubey of Business Today and India Today, our managing editor, who will give us a sense of what really lies behind all the numbers. I'm also joined by Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Professor of Economics, Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Also joined by Mihir Sharma, Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and columnist. Also joining me now is Sanjeev Ahluwalia, Advisor at the Observer Research Foundation. We'll have more voices joining us in a moment. As I said, we're going to focus on 5 issues that we believe are critical to judge Nirmala Sitharaman's budget, or importantly, the challenges that she faces before the budget document is brought out. The first big question: what will it take to kickstart the growth and investment cycle? So that's the first big question that we want to raise. And I want to go at the start, before I come to my guests, to our economic intelligence dashboard and see what really it has to offer when it comes to GDP in particular. Let's take a look at what is the challenge facing Ms. Sitharaman at the moment. Now, these are the GDP numbers, saw CMIE, where, remember, 2019, the last quarter has seen 6.8%, 2018-19 across the year, which is the lowest since 2008 when the financial crisis hit the global markets, and that was 3.1. So clearly you've seen a dip, that the biggest dip really since Narendra Modi came to power. Remember, it was 3.1 was the lowest in 2008, 5.2, 5.4, steadily coming up to 6.3 when the Modi government took over. It's now, after reaching a high of 8.1 in 2015-16, come back to 6.8. So the GDP is one number that we will look at closely in this. The other number, of course, is that we will also look at FDI and try and see where the government stands when it comes to FDI and foreign investments. Take a look at foreign investments in terms of FDI figures, and they'll show again through CMIE a steady growth that's taken place, but increasingly tapering off in the last few years after the highs of 2015-16, now a certain tapering off taking place. Given those numbers, Rajiv Dubey, do you believe growth and investment is the biggest challenge? We can look at manufacturing data as well. Clearly, there seems to be, dare I say, a feel-bad factor at the moment when it comes to industry.
And also, Rajdeep, growth is clearly the biggest challenge, and within growth, it's the consumption. You know, consumption is about 70% of the economy, and we cannot deal with anything without tackling consumption, without taking it head on. What is hidden in that 6.8 number is that the last quarter of that fiscal was only 5.8%. And in an economy which is still decelerating. You can see the new numbers of June for auto will tell you that we have not hit the bottom. The economy hasn't still bottomed out. It's going to go further down before it gets any better. And FDI numbers are only a marginal fall, but it's practically flat, you know, in the past 3 years. So as far as the economy is concerned, the biggest challenge right now is how do we ensure that consumption takes off, in which case, you know, economic activity takes off, in which case investments take off, and in which case you get jobs.
Okay, let's go right across. Mihir Sharma, your first thoughts. Is that the biggest challenge now for Nirmala Sitharaman, or indeed this government? They've got to give enough of a sense through this budget that growth and investment is the priority this time.
Well, you know, I think I'm going to disagree with Rajiv a little. I think that it is true that the slowdown we're seeing now is driven by the fact that consumption is weak for the first time in a while. But the truth is that I think that we've forgotten that investment is a driver of the economy, and investment has been weak for so long that now we're looking at the immediate problem, which is the slowdown in consumption, and saying, you know, we need to do something about it. I feel that what needs to be done first is investment and exports, which are the true long-term drivers of the economy. Those have to be revived. Consumption will follow. But investment and exports are the first step.
Professor Mehrotra?
I completely agree with Mihir, actually, because consumption is, of course, a problem. But let me, you know, instead of repeating what Mihir is saying, I'm agreeing with him. But why is consumption as low as it is? It's because wages are not growing. Real wages have remained flat. These are my estimates based on most recent data released. wages have been flat. If wages are flat, why should we be surprised that consumption is not growing? Therefore, we have to go back to the bigger issues to why investment is not growing. I think we know that private investment is not growing because of the NPAs and because the animal spirits are not there. And in addition, as Mihir rightly said, exports have not been growing. In fact, it's tragic what happened in the first 4 years of the government from 2014-15 to 17-18, that the total value of exports, merchandise exports, actually fell. The dollar value of exports actually fell, but why should we be surprised? Because you had demonetization, unorganized sector still accounts for 45% of exports, quite apart from most of the jobs. So, there are deep problems in the economy.
Professor, Dr. Anuwale, if you looked at the early part of the year, when the interim budget came out, Narendra Modi's government had one agenda: to win an election. They won an election and they won it with a big majority now. So there are no encumbrances. There is possibly, even in the Rajya Sabha, not very few encumbrances in pushing through legislation. So there can be no excuses. In Modi 1.0, he could have argued that he was a first-time Prime Minister, he was treading cautiously. What do you see changing in Modi 2.0, given the fact that he has to now be seen as a Prime Minister who is driving growth, not simply a Prime Minister who's there with worthy schemes like Ujjwala or Swachh Bharat or Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, but he needs to now actually go in for structural reform or indeed take some genuine big ticket reforms. Do you see that happening?
Rajdeep, I think that it is in the DNA of the BJP to continue to remain focused on elections, as it is in the DNA of any party that would have won with a landslide. I mean, let's be very realistic about what we can expect from a party that has won with such a big margin. However, I think coming back to the issue of investment growth, jobs, which is kind of linked, I think there is one thing that the FM does need to do today. I mean, we are always assuming that it's Modi who's the front runner, even while writing the budget, and maybe you're right.
No, are you telling me that the Prime Minister's office is not the one which is guiding the budgetary exercise? That would be, that would be flying against all conventional wisdom at the moment. An all-powerful PMO is going to let North Block decide the budget?
Yes. No, I'm an old timer. So I like to keep these illusions alive that, it's the finance minister who is key to formulating the budget.
Yes.
And we should, I think, treat Madam Sitharaman in that way, because we don't really know how she will perform or how strong or weak she'll be. We'll come to know day after tomorrow. But I think the one thing she needs to do, which is crucial to all the issues that I've mentioned over here, is that all of us focus on the investment, the fiscal deficit and so on. None of us focus on the revenue deficit, whereas that is the housekeeper's real index of prudence in terms of expenditure. Our revenue deficit is now 2.2%, right? Because a lot of schemes have got pancaked on top of each other historically, because there was a feeling that money is not the problem for this government in Modi 1.0, right? That was the feeling. We now know that is not true, and this is actually a fiscal doklam that is facing the finance minister today.
I like the word fiscal doklam. Good.
Yeah. So I think I think the one thing she should do, which sends a very strong signal that this government means business, that they are going to be very concerned about where they're putting their money, is to reduce, even if it is marginally, bring it below 2%, which it hasn't been for the last several years.
That's going to be extremely difficult.
No.
Who's going to kickstart this growth and investment cycle? At the end of the day, the government in the past has set disinvestment targets. How have they tried to achieve those targets? By merging one PSU with the other. Let's be very clear. What is it that the government needs to do now to convince investors who remain wary at the moment? What is it that they need to do?
So Rajdeep, investment is not going to come out of hope and fresh air. It has to be seen what the government's intent has to be seen on the ground for it to be coming. If you have 70% capacity utilization today, 72%, investment is not going to happen. Unless they see that consumption is growing to the extent that they can hope that in a year and a half, they could expect that capacity utilization will be in the range of 80%, and so they can start thinking of. So where we differ, both of us. I mean, I agree with what they are saying, and I'm sure they'll agree with what I'm saying. What I'm talking about is immediate measures. Immediate measure requires you to push consumption. Definitely, you require exports to take off. Do you require investment? Without private investment, you don't have an economy.
But whenever you ask government officials, they say, look at the global economy, there's a global slowdown. Whenever you ask them this, they say, that's the excuse now. It's a global slowdown. Don't blame us. It's happening across the world.
It is surely a global slowdown, Rajdeep, but our economy, thankfully, unlike China, is 2/3 Indian. So we can deal with it. It's, we only need to worry about 1/3 of the economy. China has to deal with, worry about 70% of its economy.
How do you
incentivize,
incentivize industry? How do you incentivize private investment at the end of the day?
I think the crucial question here is, why is it that private industry has not taken the government at its word? The government has said, we are fixing things for business. And private industry has said, yes, you are, but has not allowed, but the money has not followed.
No, the private industry, so right? Just as the government says global slowdown, private industry says, look at the banking sector. They are not lending, the RBI can ease monetary policy, but the bankers are reluctant to lend to us.
In this global slowdown, Bangladesh has managed to grow its exports by over 100% in the past 6 or 7 years. Mm-hmm. Vietnam is growing its exports at between 8 and 14% at various points in, over the past 5 or 6 years. All the other countries that are in our position as major exporters have big export growth. We are the one country that is not being able to do this, and we have to ask ourselves why. And it is because our exporters continue to be uncompetitive. They don't have the flexibility of markets that would render them competitive. They are too small, they have too much difficulty getting access to credit, and they have too much difficulty getting access to global markets.
And exports apart, the other reason why the private sector hasn't taken government at face value is, if you look at the amount of stranded projects, it's 6.69 lakh crore. 6.69 lakh crore, of which almost 3.5 lakh crore is in the government public sector. Now that is something surely the government can deal with. If you haven't been able to kickstart those projects for want of land, labor or capital, whatever it may be, the fact is that the intent is not showing on the ground.
But is that the big dampener, in a sense, to manufacturing, this tepid investment climate? Do you agree with that? That the government could well turn around and say, look, the global climate is tepid. People are thinking twice at the moment across the world from investing. You're seeing you've seen the plateauing of FDI numbers. Don't blame us. I think the attitude which you hear from government is, don't blame us. We're trying our best to ensure the ease of doing business. We're talking of Make in India. We're making all the right noises. What do we do beyond a point?
But there are some things that, government should do, which in fact, if you look at the old speeches of the FMs, they have been wanting to do. And this is to liberalize agricultural exports. There is really no reason why we should still today need to, with our warehouses full of food grains, 60% more than what we need. We don't need to control agricultural exports the way we do. Let them free so that our farmers that we talk so much about, whose incomes have to be doubled, they will find the export.
I'll come to agriculture income, but corporate India, the general feeling was, after Mr. Modi was labelled Sood Boot Ki Sarkar in 2015, there was a pushback. They decided no budget that we put out should be seen as a budget which is pro-corporate India. Corporate India for the longest time now is asking, for example, for tax reliefs. The government has been reluctant despite Arun Jaitley promising in 2015 a process by which corporate taxes would be lowered. It's not happened. So corporate India, or those who really, or the small and medium industry, the micro industries, have still not recovered from demonetization in 2016. They don't trust this government. How do you restore trust?
That's a more difficult question, but I was about to answer your question on the corporates, Rajdeep. You see, what the government will say in response is that we have reduced tax rates for the MSMEs. However, put your finger on it rightly by saying that, you know, that corporate rates which had been announced that they will be reduced very early on 5 years ago, those rates have not come down. And it's the corporates who tend to lead the investment cycle, and that's not happening. So clearly the government will have to come good on its 4 or 5 year old promise that the corporate tax rates have to become comparable to the rates prevailing in Asia. Therefore, that is an action that is, we are hoping for.
The reason I'm asking for this is a budget of a majority government that has been re-elected.
Right.
There are no pressures this time. There are no votes to be, to be obtained. There's no immediate election. Yes, you've got Maharashtra, Haryana. You've got Maharashtra, Haryana, but that's still 3 or 4 months away. At the moment, no, as of today, compared to what happened in February, where you clearly had an interim budget with an eye on getting votes, post 2015, the Soot Boot Ki Sarkar meant the government did, make a conscious policy shift, focusing on pro-poor schemes and the pro-poor image of the Prime Minister. I want to know this time, there is no pressure. Therefore, do you believe this is the best chance, in a way, Nirmala Sitharaman can stamp her authority in budget number 1?
This is a good, I mean, first two budgets are always the best chance as far as the government is concerned to push through not so popular measures. But does the government have the fiscal leeway to be able to do that? Here in this case, even if you want to encourage corporate investments or leave more cash in the hands of the corporates, the 5% reduction for large corporates is going to cost the government a bomb. If it can it afford to do it? It can't, because your GST is still not stabilized. It's back to under 1 lakh crore right now.
Good point.
I just want to supplement what Rajiv is saying, and also come back to a point that Sanjeev had made earlier about revenue deficit. You see, in a situation where the private investment is not reviving, and there are deeper reasons than simply the NPAs, but in that situation, what choice does the government have but to increase public investment to GDP ratio? Now, but the trouble is, for the last several years, public investment in absolute terms is rising, but that's only because the economy is growing. But the fact of the matter is, as a proportion of GDP, it's actually been shrinking. And an important reason for that is the revenue deficit is very high. And so what one will expect in this budget is that there is an attempt made to contain the revenue deficit to the maximum extent possible, but that requires some medium-term expenditure framework, and we are not getting that kind of medium-term expenditure framework. The government has just come back to power. We are hoping that it comes up with a 3-year medium-term expenditure framework in which it lays out a plan of action to keeping revenue deficit down, so that release resources for public investment, because increasing public investment will crowd in private investment.
Let's take an example. Let's take Narega, right? Now, NGNREGA. Now, the allocation for that has been steadily increased by Modi 1.0, right? Mm-hmm. Even though when they came first, they said this is a completely useless program. Now, even within Narega, if you were to target Narega to those areas which actually need employment, rather than spending most of it in Tamil Nadu and in other high-income states, you would be able to save money. This is a pedestrian issue. It's not even a political issue, because Tamil Nadu is not going to elections till 2021. It's a pedestrian bureaucratic issue. Why are those levers not working?
Okay.
That is a big issue in this government.
Let's come then to the second challenge. And the second challenge is the challenge of job creation. It was, according to the government, exaggerated in the media, but the figures clearly suggest that there is a major challenge facing the government. Let's turn once again to our economic intelligence dashboard and look at the challenges that are facing the government when it comes now to jobs. This is the other big issue that we want to raise today. Take a look at when it comes to the job market at the moment. Let's turn to really where the government stands. Our employment exchange is out here. Just a minute. You've got the employment exchange, and take a look at the CMI numbers, of course, which the government dismisses. But this is where the government stands at the moment. The annual average that is being pointed Jan to May is 7%. Clearly, there is a problem. Take a look at the PLFS figures as well. In every figure, as you will see, unemployment has steadily shot up, and clearly the last 5 years have perhaps seen that as the big challenge facing the Modi government. The government remains in denial, but the numbers suggest otherwise. Rajiv Dubey.
Also, the June numbers are even more glaring. You know, it's 9%, even by the CMI number. So unemployment is not going away without, without causing significant distress in the economy and the socio-economic framework in the country. And none of this is going to work unless we have greenfield investments, Rajdeep. One of the opportunities that we have in greenfield investments is to ensure that some amount of defense local manufacturing can be done alongside private sector, which can ensure that the import substitution can be reduced, because otherwise you are not going to see any greenfield investment. The industries where capacity utilization is 70% are not going to see greenfield investment. You have to come up into industries where you could expect if you turn to government officials, they say, look at the investments that we are making in infrastructure, look at the large investment projects that we are putting in there. How can you say there is no job creation, A? And B, they say all these job figures that you are putting out don't see what's happening in the informal sector and the employment that we are managing to create there. You don't agree, Professor Mehrotra?
No, not at all. How can one agree with that kind of proposition when we know for 45 years the NSSO has been estimating employment and unemployment rates when the sample includes informal sector work. So all the Mudra work, all the Ola Uber, all the platform economy jobs are actually captured there. So that's been a non-tenable argument for a very long period of time. Let's not even waste our time, honestly, on that argument. Let's pick up the public investment point. I was saying in my earlier intervention that public investment by the central government as a proportion of GDP has not been growing, it has been falling. You see, let's look at the historical pattern in respect of public investment. Who does the public investment? It's the state governments. The central government, if anything, has felt, because it's in a fiscal consolidation mode in the last 5 or 6 years, it has not managed to increase public investment to GDP ratio. And as we was discussing earlier, revenue deficit is putting a crunch on public investment. So, the jobs cannot suddenly start growing in a situation where public investment GDP is falling.
So, in a sense, challenge 2 is linked to challenge 1.
Yes.
That, that unless you stimulate investments, unless you convince private investors that we are here with a long-term growth story, and we have sustained policies that we are going to keep a continuity in policies, there will be no disruption. Presumably what you've got to convince people, you can't have what you did in 2016 again in 2019 with demonetization, where suddenly MSMEs found life was very difficult, and many of them tell me that they're still struggling to recover 3 years later.
And you need greenfield, Rajdeep. Greenfield, I'm insisting, because brownfield is of no help.
But how are you going
One company acquiring another company is of no help. It actually reduces job. It doesn't increase jobs.
See, Rajdeep,
so you need greenfield investment.
Yes.
Another pedestrian issue. Unfortunately, in the last 4 or 5 years, ever since we had Modi 1, we've forgotten pedestrian issues. For example, the quality of public investment. The quality, if you are short on money, what would you do? You would first finish projects which were pending before going on to new and grander projects. Now, unless this is followed consistently, it doesn't sound very good.
So what can Ms. Sitharaman do in that sense in a budget? Because there are limits of how much you can actually do in a budget document. What is the signal she can send out?
Behind the budget document is the Department of Expenditure, which is choosing on which public investment money is to be spent. That is under her. So Madam Sitharaman should sit down with the Department of Expenditure bureaucrats and say, I want outcomes, I want final outcomes, not incessant and increasing area of new projects, as is currently happening.
Mir, what is the, how deep is this challenge of job creation? Are we exaggerating the nature of the challenge? Piyush Goyal, for example, every time you raise the question, say, look at the economic activity that the government is engaging in. Don't you believe that jobs are being created every time we push ahead with mega schemes of the government?
Look, it's very hard to argue with the various numbers that have come out. The government has not yet come out with any quantitative rebuttal of CMI, of the PLFS, of the NSSO. No quantitative rebuttal has yet emerged. They promised one. You can say, how can an economy grow at 7% with these jobs? Or you can say, we've done all this and therefore there must be jobs. All these things are arguments and we have to listen to them with respect, but I don't think that there is any, I don't think they carry enough water if you look at them, you know,
So what's the solution?
The solution here I'm sorry to say, is a bit of a reversal from how the Modi government has operated so far. Look, they took a bet in the first, in their first term, and their bet was, we increase public spending, we push a little bit of this oil windfall that we've got, we push it into building a few things, we borrow a bit of money, you know, through directly through our PSUs, and keep this spending tap going, and the private sector will follow. That was bet number one. It has not worked. All right, that idea that it would stimulate the economy, stimulate investment, that has not worked. For whatever reason, we don't need to go into it. Bet number two, the personal image of the Prime Minister is sufficient to guarantee that pro-business reform will continue to take place. Right? That was the other. So the Prime Minister has, as Chief Minister, had a certain track record. As Prime Minister, made certain pro-business statements, and we can now trust a government led by him. That bet has also not panned out because the Prime Minister doesn't run everything in the government. You need institutional change. You need to trust that the tax guy who comes to deal with you, that tax guy won't bother you. At that point, there's no point saying that the Prime Minister is on my side.
Okay. We've got a sense of where we stand on these two big issues. When we return, I'll turn to issue number 3. And that's going to be agriculture. Because I think, in a sense, the government's twin challenges are lying in jobs and agriculture. At least that was before the election. Now, with a massive verdict, the Prime Minister is promising to double agricultural incomes by 2022. Realistic? Let's raise the third big challenge facing the government. How will the government raise agricultural incomes? Remember, this is a question being asked at a time when the Prime Minister maintains that he intends to double agricultural incomes by 2022. No sign of that. Joining our panel also now is Sunil Sinha, Director and Principal Economist, India Ratings, got held up in the traffic, which is another issue of infrastructure, which is going to be a permanent crisis. Urban infrastructure and smart cities, an issue to raise on another day. But let's focus on agriculture for a moment. Sunil, do you see any merit at all in these claims being made that we will double agricultural incomes? Do you believe again here we've got a long-term structural crisis facing Indian agriculture with no easy solutions available?
Absolutely, Rajdeep. In fact, if you look at the whole agricultural policy that we are pursuing in this country, it appears as if we are still the overarching philosophy or the policy that guides the agricultural production in this country is as if we are in a food deficit economy. And as a result of that, most of the policies are framed or pursued keeping that particular fact in mind. As a result of that, neither we have been able to really get into the real issues which are facing the agriculture, namely the productivity, the agricultural supply chain, all of these being talked about, but no real solution has been attempted. And at the same time, one of the biggest challenges that we are facing is that we are piling the food grains, but we just cannot sell it in the international market because we choose to sell it according to our convenience, as opposed to the demand and supply conditions that exist.
So has the time come, Rajiv, to unleash the animal spirits of Indian agriculture? I mean, look, every finance minister, when you speak to them in interviews or off camera, say, look, we want to focus on agriculture, we want to free up agriculture. Eventually, politics takes over. And politicians, particularly state and local level politicians, are reluctant, it would seem, to free up agriculture.
If you look at the commitment as far as the government is concerned, even in the BJP manifesto, it says 25 lakh crore is going to be spent on agri infrastructure building in 5 years. That's 5 lakh crore per annum. I don't know where that money is going to come from. That itself is a huge question mark, as it is in the case of infrastructure, where we are committing 20 lakh crore per annum in the 5 years. But that's besides the point. The question as far as agriculture is that, you know, the farmer, if he doesn't get the most remunerative income for his produce, we are not going to be able to solve the agri problem. For that, you need the whole supply chain, and you need the sales infrastructure closest to the farm. As much as and the production and processing infrastructure as close to the farm as possible. Those are broken supply chains, and what he's talking about, Mr. Sinha is talking about, is essentially reflecting in that, because we are piling on our food grain production, piling those on into our warehouses, and then we are practically
Because
wasting
let's
them.
be clear, the Narendra Modi government, when it came to power, said we want to taper inflation, which they successfully did. They made it clear we are not going to go down the route that the Manmohan Singh government did when it came to raising MSP for agriculture produce. By year 4, they had gone back to MSP because they realized they needed votes. So I'm just wondering whether agriculture is so caught up in political realities. There the elections that come up in Maharashtra, Haryana, one eye is always on the electorate. You are unwilling to truly open up Indian agriculture, open up those supply links, create an environment where agriculture is driven by demand and supply, not by government choices.
3 or 4 points as to what can be done, and some of that can be done in the budget. First of all, exports have to be freed up, because every East Asian country became a success story because of an agricultural revolution first, before they had an industrial revolution. How did that happen? They became food self-sufficient. We've been food self-sufficient for a long time. So clearly there needs to be a little greater focus in the budget and otherwise also on non-staples. What does that imply? The implication there is that the budget should do something particularly for warehousing for non-staples. We've got reasonable amount, well, we don't have enough silos even for the staples, but for the non-staples, I think we have to begin to build a supply chain. That means supply chain has to be perhaps incentivized to a much greater extent than has been undertaken so far. In this, let's not please go for food parks. The government is thinking seriously about even more food parks. I don't think there has been any evidence to suggest that the food parks have been successful. The initiatives have to be much more decentralized than these mega food park kind of things.
Do you see agriculture as the one? I mean, if you want to look at dark spots in Modinomics 1.0, whatever Modinomics really stands for, 1.0, it was agriculture. You had a minister who was lackluster. You had a government which seemed to be struggling, to come to terms with what will it really take to kickstart agriculture. And falling agriculture incomes is a reality that we faced in the last 18 months.
Look, I think that for any government, including the Modi government, you have multiple different considerations here. You cannot upset the urban middle class with high food prices and high inflation, because we'll all sit here and scream, right? You cannot upset actual farmers too much, so you have to at least give them some degree of remunerative return. And unfortunately, it seems that you cannot upset the local elites that control, the marketing supply chain and so on and so forth. I think the big political bet that the Prime Minister now has to take is to ignore these 3 factors and look at it 5 years and 7 years from now. The only way that you're going to break agriculture out of this trap is to be the first government in a very long time to forget about these 3 factors. And you can do that by, for example, calling your chief ministers. You've said so often, I need my states on board. Call your chief ministers, your BJP chief ministers at least, and tell them, sign up to the Model Agricultural Marketing Act. All right? The ENAM is not working. They pushed it for a while. It's not working. Sign up to the Agricultural Act. Second, the private sector must be allowed to do whatever it wants in building cold chains, supply chains, plow to port, as Ashok Gulati says. Right? The private sector must be allowed to do that. You know what? And you know why the private sector is scared? Think about 3 or 4 years ago when the price of dal went up and people started making a noise in Parliament. Who were the people who suffered?
Trades.
The private equity guys who had invested in the supply chain for pulses. That kind of thing, people have a long memory for that.
But this is a Prime Minister who's a consummate politician. At the end of the day, he's won a big victory. He'll say, look, you guys in studios can keep talking about agrarian distress. You can keep talking about...
What has he won this victory for? Has he won this victory to change India and to double
He
farmers'
has-
income, or has he just won this victory and that's it?
No, so therefore, where is the compulsion? Where's the pressure to change? Where's the pressure? If I'm winning in deep agricultural lands of this country, despite television studios talking about agrarian distress or no job creation, the Prime Minister could say, don't worry, be happy, we'll continue along this path. More pro-poor schemes.
So Rajdeep, look, I mean, let's be clear on one thing, that even if agriculture starts growing at 4%, which it hasn't for a long time, instead of 2.5%, there's not going to be a miracle effect on growth. The effect will be less than 40 basis points, or maybe even less. So it's not going to affect your growth trajectory much. But what it is going to do, it is going to energize the rural sector. It is going to put more incomes into the hands of people who have felt neglected for so very long. Exactly like Mr. Trump came to power because middle America was neglected. So I think it's very important. So for that, one is of course liberalize exports and marketing and all. And I don't think that if you liberalize exports, any of the kulaks or anybody else who is part of the elite vested interest in agriculture are going to be upset by that.
In the past they have been, and there are various local interests that work in this sector. But let's turn to two more challenges. We've got limited time and I'm going to combine the two because they are linked. What structural reforms can the finance minister undertake on priority? And linked to that is the question of building India into a $5 trillion economy target, possibly by 2024. What are those structural reforms? Term one of Mr. Modi was, according to some in government, about plumbing, about sort of filling in the, plugging in all the gaps that existed in the previous government. Now he's got to think big. He can be a risk taker. This is his moment to go down in history as an economic visionary. Do you see that happening? Or is he a more conservative politician who's unwilling to take those big risks? Land, labor, capital. We saw what happened with land in 2014-15 in his first budget.
I think, Rajdeep, thinking about big structural reforms, we've been talking about it all the time, but...
what are those structural reforms that you'd like to see?
I really don't think that there are any structural reforms, except the one, land, labor, that really a government can do. But as we know, these are very contentious issues, and it has
banking reform,
huge
financial reform, banking reforms.
Yes. So I'm coming to what I can clearly see, that the way they pushed and implemented GST, which is the indirect tax reform, what they can possibly do is in the direct tax reform. Here, let's not forget that almost equivalent to our fiscal deficit, that is the amount which is still stuck in different cases. So the pending tax recovery is of the similar quantum as much as our fiscal deficit is. So the issue is that if you are able to do a similar kind of reform in direct taxes, so your income tax, your corporate tax, and also come up with a roadmap of at least 5 years so far as tax reforms are concerned, because one of the major issues that is facing economy at the moment is also investment. Now you talk to the guys, they say that if I don't know how the corporate tax structure is going to evolve, that is going to impact ultimately what is my return on my investment. So you have to have a clear strategy, clear blueprint which is laid out, like we did it in the past in case of, say, customs duty. We had a 5-year or 6 years.
Do you see that, again we come back to it, if you talk, you talk about a 5 trillion economy, there's shock and awe factor. Look, we are looking, which will require actually, according to some figures, a growth of 11.8% per annum leading up to 2024 at the very real term. So, how do you do it?
Rajdeep, there's a trick in that $5 trillion economy number. That economy number, if we continue growing at 7.5%, only 7.5% with an inflation of 4%, we are going to be home. So the $5 trillion economy number, if we go by nominal rate of GDP, which is what it is all about, we are going to be there, irrespective. It's not a stretch target. As far as the structural reforms are concerned, the biggest structural reforms are outside the financial sector. which is administrative reforms, which is judicial reforms. Those are the ones that can really help, apart from the direct tax code, of course, and many of the banking reforms which are required. But the big reforms are administrative reforms and judicial reforms, labor market reforms. These are the ones that are required to get the economy going in the long term.
These are politically contentious. Where does he start? You see, in 2014 he started with land and found that land was a hot potato. Where does the Prime Minister start? This is, as I said, the Prime Minister with the biggest majority, in a way, the most powerful Prime Ministers India has perhaps ever had, or certainly since Indira Gandhi. Where does he start? There will be no opposition to him in Parliament this time.
Well, the one place he can certainly start is banking reform. One was hoping that what will happen is that the banks, that means the public sector banks' governance, will be improved before the capitalization of the banks begins. Unfortunately, that is not what is happening. So we may well be throwing good money after bad. Where is the guarantee that these banks will not start lending?
So you would start with banking reform?
Absolutely. This is by far the most important, because that will ensure perhaps that the credibility of our banking system will be restored.
But again, you've got the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister supporters who say, look, we brought in the insolvency and bankruptcy code. We are making efforts towards financial reform. What more? Where do we start now?
Within the banking system itself, it goes into the nitty-gritty of public sector banks' governance. That's the problem.
Okay. Where would you start?
I think labor reform is where you start first. All right.
Which is the most politically contentious in a way. Many believe it's even more contentious than land.
How is it contentious, Rajdeep, when the size of the formal sector has been shrinking so much? This is not the 1990s. Tomorrow, everyone in the formal sector of the public sector goes on strike. We will barely notice it. It doesn't matter if the public sector banks shut down. It doesn't matter if India Post shuts down. We are all using Paytm and DHL anyway. All right. So the point is, you have to power through it. You have to break the power of these unions, and you have to create flexibility in.
So you would start with labor.
Start with labor, because that is the biggest signal you can possibly give to absolutely everybody, that this is the one thing that nobody's been able to do, and I've been able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, these are nice.
That's a very attractive way to put it before the Prime Minister. If you tell him that this is something no one's able to do, and I'm the first, I go down in history.
I send him these notes every day.
That's right, exactly. Go ahead, Professor.
So these are great, silver bullets that the Prime Minister should accept and then fire. But it seems unlikely that you'll do it. So let me add a smaller silver bullet, which is a subset of labor sector reform, which is, why not start with genuine disinvestment? You need capital, you need money. There are PSUs that are bleeding.
So no more half-hearted efforts at disinvestment.
Yeah. And that's a much simpler thing than generalized labor reform, which brings forth a lot
And there will be no opposition to disinvestment in the present climate at all.
Well, I mean, there's always...
You've seen Sonia Gandhi, I see only today, has opposed the attempts being made in Raebareli.
Precisely. But
for privatizing the rail factory there.
But they are not of much
consequence. Is not disinvestment any which way.
No,
so you're talking about genuine disinvestment to raise resources?
Privatization. I'm talking of privatization
across the board,
and not
privatization,
and not to raise resources, but to increase efficiency.
But to increase the efficiency of
so
capital.
Not just to raise resources, but primarily to increase efficiency.
We've lost track of the purpose of privatization by saying disinvestment income. The purpose is efficiency.
And number two, he should undo a self goal that the BJP has managed, which is this fascination with a strong rupee. Because if you keep your rupee strong, no one will invest in India, because you're opening yourself up to import competition.
That's another debate which we will have on another day, a contentious issue. But let me come to you, Professor Sinha, at the end. Where would you start? The 5 trillion economy dream, where does Nirmala Sitharaman start?
I think if you
when it comes to structural reform.
So if you really look at the current state of affairs, then I guess, like my fellow panelists are saying, I think the financial sector is too important to be ignored at the moment, because if credit flow is not happening to the real sector, then no matter what you do, you will not be able to even keep the ongoing growth momentum. So to step up the growth momentum, the first thing is that not only you fix the banking sector issues, but you also fix the non-banking sector issues. Let's not forget that most of the space that was vacated by the banking sector in the last couple of years was actually grabbed by NBFC, and they did a phenomenal job. But now that they are facing or passing through a difficult time, it is extremely important that we rechannelize, re-energize our banking sector so that at least they reach out to the people who are in need of credit.
Okay, I think there's a consensus on that. We've got 10 seconds. Yes.
No, I just wanted to reinforce the point that Mihir was making about labor reform. I just want to clarify, however, what is doable. I think Mihir's expectations are way too high. On labor reform, the government had already come up with 4 codes and had compressed about 35 existing central government laws into 4 codes. I think they have to be fine-tuned, tweaked, and they need to come to Parliament so that they are thoroughly discussed.
Let's leave it there. Clearly, she has a long list of items on her menu. Nirmala Sitharaman has a great opportunity, in a sense, to really establish herself as a politician of substance. Remember, 10 years ago, she was a party spokesperson, a newly appointed one. It's been the most meteoric rise, and if her rise can be matched by the rise in the economy, then we'll be doing rather well. Thanks very much for watching. Thanks very much for giving us your insights. That's it on this pre-budget roundtable. We'll be back with more in the days ahead.
Thanks for watching the video. For more such news and updates, please like, share and subscribe to India Today. Also check out our other great videos from our channel. We know you will love to.